the zone of silence, where communication and compasses fail. In the Mapimi Desert in northern Mexico, in the desolate borderlands where Durango, Chihuahua, and Coahuila meet, there exists a roughly 50-kilometer area called La Zona del Silencio, the zone of silence, where radio signals allegedly don't transmit, where compasses spin uselessly, where electromagnetic phenomena behave in ways that violate normal physics, where communication equipment fails consistently and inexplicably, where the laws governing radio propagation and magnetic fields seem to be suspended or altered by forces or conditions that science hasn't adequately explained despite decades of investigation and speculation. The zone gained international attention in 1970 when an American Athena test rocket launched from Green Sands Missile Base in Utah went dramatically off course and crashed in the area. A guidance failure that required U.S. military personnel to cross into Mexico to retrieve the rocket and its payload, an incident that brought American scientists and engineers face to face with the zone's reputation and allegedly with its anomalous properties, leading to investigations that supposedly confirmed something unusual about the location, while also generating conspiracy theories about what the military really found there, what they might have been testing, whether the rocket failure was accident, or whether the zone itself somehow pulled the missile off course through mechanisms that conventional physics doesn't describe. Local ranchers and residents have known about the area for generations, reporting that radios don't work, that compasses become unreliable, that the zone is cursed or haunted or touched by something that makes it different from surrounding desert, that animals behave strangely there, that lights appear in the sky with unusual frequency, that time itself feels distorted when you're in the zone's center, that people have gotten lost despite the terrain being flat and navigable, disoriented by the failure of their equipment and by something about the space that makes direction and distance ambiguous. Scientists who've studied the zone point to geological factors: high concentrations of magnetic minerals in the soil, unusual rock formations that might affect radio propagation, the area's location at roughly the same latitude as the Bermuda Triangle and Egyptian pyramids, creating what some call an energy belt around the planet where anomalies cluster. Though this last claim ventures into pseudoscience that mainstream researchers reject. But the explanations feel incomplete, feel like they're describing symptoms rather than causes, accounting for some observations while leaving others unexplained, leaving the zone of silence hovering between explicable geological anomaly and genuinely mysterious location, where the normal rules don't quite apply, where something about the specific configuration of matter and energy creates conditions that aren't supposed to exist according to conventional understanding of how electromagnetic radiation propagates and how magnetic fields function, making it either fascinating case study in unusual but ultimately comprehensible geological and atmospheric conditions, or genuine anomaly that suggests our physics is incomplete, that there are effects and interactions we haven't cataloged, that locations can exist where reality works differently, not because supernatural forces are present, but because natural forces interact in ways we haven't observed elsewhere, and that we don't have adequate theories to explain, leaving the zone of silence as it has been since people first noticed its strangeness, a place where communication fails, where navigation becomes uncertain, where the technological systems we rely on stop functioning reliably, where you're forced to confront how dependent you've become on electromagnetic radiation for information and connection and orientation, and what it means when that medium stops working, when the invisible infrastructure of radio and magnetism that we navigate by simply isn't there or doesn't function properly, leaving you in silence, in isolation, in disorientation that's spatial and technological, and perhaps something else, something about the zone that affects consciousness or perception in ways that transcend mere equipment failure, that makes the space feel wrong in addition to being technically anomalous. That transforms a patch of desert into something that locals avoid and that visitors find disturbing, not because of danger in conventional sense, but because of the profound wrongness of a place where fundamental things we take for granted. The ability to communicate, to navigate, to orient ourselves through instruments we trust, simply stop working without clear reason, without adequate explanation, without the comfort of understanding why this place is different, why it's silent, why it's strange. The historical accounts of the zone predate modern technology, with local indigenous peoples and early Spanish colonizers, noting that the area had unusual characteristics, that animals avoided it, that travelers reported disorientation, that it had a reputation as a place of mystery long before radios and compasses existed to fail there. This suggests that whatever makes the zone anomalous isn't purely about modern electromagnetic technology, but involves properties that humans have perceived across centuries, effects that manifested in different ways depending on the technology available, as spiritual wrongness in pre-technological eras, as navigational difficulty in the age of exploration, as communication failure in the radio age, as whatever the zone will disrupt in future technologies we develop. The 1970 Athena rocket incident is well-documented fact, not legend. An Athena missile launched from Utah, carrying cobalt-57 canisters for atmospheric testing, went wildly off course and crashed in the Mapimi Desert, requiring a joint US-Mexican recovery operation to retrieve the radioactive payload. The official explanation cites guidance system failure, but the fact that the missile crashed specifically in the zone of silence, hundreds of miles from its intended trajectory, sparked immediate speculation that the zone itself had somehow affected the rocket, had pulled it off course through anomalous magnetic or electromagnetic fields, had demonstrated that its effects could reach into the sky, could affect objects in flight, making it not just surface phenomenon, but volumetric anomaly extending upward into the atmosphere. The subsequent US Air Force investigation of the area allegedly found unusual magnetic readings, confirmed difficulties with radio communication, and noted the high concentration of magnetic minerals in the soil, including magnetite and other iron-rich materials that could theoretically affect magnetic compasses and might affect radio propagation under certain conditions. But the official reports, if they still exist in accessible form, don't claim the zone represents physics. Defying anomaly, just unusual geological conditions that create predictable effects on electromagnetic equipment. The gap between this measured conclusion and the dramatic claims about the zone's properties represents the space where legend amplifies reality, where unusual becomes impossible, where difficult radio transmission becomes absolute silence. The geological explanation focuses on the Cretaceous rock formations underlying the area, which contain high concentrations of magnetic minerals that accumulated through ancient volcanic activity and sedimentation processes. These minerals create localized variations in Earth's magnetic field that would make compass readings unreliable, particularly if the user doesn't know to account for these variations. The same minerals could theoretically affect radio propagation by absorbing or reflecting certain frequencies, creating dead zones where transmission is attenuated, though not completely blocked. This accounts for the zone's characteristics within known physics, makes it unusual but not anomalous, interesting but not impossible. But this explanation struggles with several observations. Radio communication doesn't fail completely in the zone. It becomes unreliable and difficult, which is different from the absolute silence that the name suggests and that some accounts describe. Modern GPS systems, which rely on satellite communication rather than ground-based radio, function normally in the zone, suggesting that whatever interference exists is frequency-specific rather than universal electromagnetic disruption. And compasses, while affected by local magnetic variations, still function. They just point to local magnetic north rather than true north, which is annoying but not mysterious if you understand that magnetic compasses respond to local field conditions rather than to some universal directional reference. The meteorite claims add another dimension. Some researchers note that the zone of silence has unusually high meteorite fall frequency, with more meteorites recovered from the area than would be statistically expected for its size. This has generated theories about unusual gravitational or magnetic properties that might attract or pull meteorites toward the zone, though conventional physics doesn't support mechanisms by which surface magnetic fields could affect meteorite trajectories significantly enough to create concentration effects. Alternative explanations suggest that the meteorite concentration is observational artifact, the flat, open terrain, and the presence of researchers specifically looking for anomalies means meteorites that fall. There are more likely to be noticed and recovered than meteorites that fall in more vegetated or less scrutinized areas. The biological anomalies are more speculative. Claims about unusual plant mutations, animals born with defects, human visitors experiencing time distortions, or consciousness alterations. These enter territory where verification is difficult and where natural baseline variations in biology and psychology are easily interpreted as zone-specific effects by observers primed to find anomalies. The Athena rocket's Cobalt-57 payload means the crash site had radioactive contamination, which could cause biological effects. But this is localized to the impact site rather than being characteristic of the entire zone. The comparative latitude claims that the zone of silence sits at roughly the same latitude as the Bermuda Triangle and the Egyptian pyramids, suggesting a global belt of anomalies, represents numerology rather than science. While the latitudes are roughly similar, around 27 to 30 degrees north, this is coincidence rather than meaningful correlation. Millions of square kilometers exist at these latitudes, and selecting specific locations that have acquired mysterious reputations doesn't demonstrate that latitude itself is causally relevant. The energy belt concept lacks physical mechanism and cherry-picks locations, while ignoring the vast majority of territory at the same latitudes that shows no unusual characteristics. The UFO connection is inevitable given the zone's reputation. If compass and radio anomalies exist, if the area has unusual properties, then it becomes attractive location for UFO sightings and claims, creating feedback loop where the zone's reputation brings attention that generates more reports that reinforce the reputation. Whether UFO activity in the zone exceeds baseline rates for remote desert locations is difficult to determine because baseline rates are themselves uncertain, and because the definition of UFO activity is subjective. Unusual lights in the sky in remote areas are reported globally and have multiple explanations: atmospheric phenomena, aircraft, satellites, planets, human lighting, ball lightning, most of which have nothing to do with extraterrestrial craft. The government interest adds conspiracy dimension. The US military's presence to recover the Athena rocket, combined with the zone's proximity to what was once a military testing area and to the US-Mexico border, creates speculation that the zone serves military purposes, that its anomalous properties are being studied or exploited, that facilities exist underground, or that the area is monitored for reasons that aren't acknowledged publicly. The fact that some investigations occurred doesn't prove ongoing classified interest, but the lack of transparency around what those investigations found creates space for speculation that can't be disproven without access to potentially classified information. The tourism industry that's developed around the zone demonstrates how anomalies become commercialized. Tour operators offer expeditions to experience the zone's silence, to test communications equipment, to search for meteorites, to visit locations where unusual events allegedly occurred. This creates incentive to maintain and amplify the mystery, to emphasize the unexplained aspects while downplaying the mundane explanations, to tell tourist stories that make the zone seem more dramatic than geological surveys would suggest. The commercialization doesn't prove the zone isn't anomalous, but it does mean that accounts must be evaluated carefully for potential exaggeration motivated by tourism revenue. The time distortion claims are particularly difficult to evaluate. People report that time seems to pass differently in the zone, that hours feel like minutes, or vice versa, that watches malfunction or run at incorrect rates. These could be psychological effects. Isolation in featureless terrain creates altered time perception, expectation of temporal anomalies, creates suggestion effects that manifest as perceived distortions. Or they could represent real chronometric effects if the zone somehow affects local space-time geometry, though this would require gravitational anomalies or exotic physics that have no other evidence, and that seem implausibly dramatic for effects attributed to geological conditions alone. The question of replication is central to evaluating the zone scientifically. Have controlled experiments with standardized equipment documented the claimed effects under conditions that eliminate confounds? Has anyone conducted systematic survey with multiple compass readings at precisely documented locations to map the magnetic field variations? Has radio propagation been tested across multiple frequencies with proper controls to distinguish between signal attenuation and complete failure? Without this kind of rigorous documentation, we're left with anecdotal reports that could reflect real effects, could reflect equipment malfunction, could reflect user error, or could reflect expectations creating interpretations where technical difficulties in challenging terrain become mysterious zone effects. The psychological component is significant regardless of physical anomalies. A location that has reputation for strangeness will feel strange to visitors who know the reputation. Expectation creates hypervigilance. You notice every technical glitch, every moment of disorientation, every unusual perception, and attribute it to the zone's effects, rather than to the normal variabilities that occur everywhere, but that we don't attend to or find significant in locations that lack mysterious reputations. This doesn't mean the zone isn't unusual, but it does mean that subjective reports of strangeness must be interpreted cautiously, distinguished from objectively measurable anomalies that persist regardless of observer expectations. The indigenous perspectives deserve consideration. Local peoples who lived in the region for centuries before modern technology reported that the area was different, was to be avoided or approached with caution, had qualities that made it unsuitable for habitation or certain activities. This traditional knowledge might reflect accumulated observations of real effects. The difficult terrain, the lack of water, the magnetic variations affecting navigation, even in pre-compass eras, through subtle cues that experienced travelers detected. Or it might reflect spiritual or cultural beliefs that attributed significance to the area for reasons unrelated to physical properties, creating sacred or forbidden zones that were marked by restrictions, regardless of whether measurable anomalies existed. Whether the zone of silence represents genuine anomaly requiring new physics to explain, represents well-understood geological conditions that produce unusual but explicable effects on electromagnetic systems, or represents mostly reputation and suggestion with minimal objective basis beyond difficult terrain and localized magnetic variations, depends on which evidence you weight most heavily, which reports you trust, which explanations you find satisfying. The zone exists. It's a real place you can visit. The question is whether what you experience there reflects properties that are scientifically anomalous or reflects the interaction of known physics, challenging terrain, technical limitations of equipment, and psychological effects of expectation in a location that has acquired legendary status. The practical implications, if the zone's effects are real and reproducible, would be significant. Understanding what creates the interference could lead to development of countermeasures, could inform communication system design, could reveal physics that has applications beyond the specific zone. If the effects are strong enough to disrupt military rocket guidance systems, as the Athena incident suggests, then weaponization becomes possibility, creating artificial zones of silence that disable enemy communications, that create navigational confusion, that provide tactical advantages. The lack of obvious military exploitation of these effects, assuming they're real and controllable, suggests either that they're not as dramatic as legends claim, or that classification prevents us from knowing how they're being used. The zone of silence endures as modern mystery, as place that captures imagination because it represents boundary. Boundary between known and unknown, between reliable and unreliable, between connected and isolated, between orientated and lost. In age of ubiquitous communication, of GPS navigation, of electromagnetic systems that we depend on without thinking about them, a place where these systems fail or become uncertain is fundamentally disorienting, is a reminder of how much we've delegated to technology and how helpless we are when that technology stops working, when silence isn't choice but is imposed by environment, when navigation isn't automatic but requires dead reckoning and instinct, and the ancient skills that technology has made obsolete in most contexts, but that become essential in zones where technology fails, where communication falls silent, where compasses spin, where you're alone in ways that pre-technological humans understood intimately, but that modern humans experience rarely and find profoundly unsettling, making the zone of silence significant not just for what it is physically, but for what it represents psychologically, for how it makes us feel when we enter it, for what it reveals about our dependencies and vulnerabilities, for the way it transforms us from connected, orientated, confident navigators of modern world into isolated, uncertain, disoriented travelers who must rely on ourselves rather than on systems, who must trust our perceptions rather than our instruments, who must acknowledge that there are places, even now, even with all our technology, where we're still vulnerable to the silence, to the disorientation, to the profound strangeness of spaces that don't function according to the rules we expect, that challenge us to either explain them through science or acknowledge them as genuinely anomalous, as locations where reality works differently for reasons we don't understand and perhaps cannot understand without expanding our physics, without accepting that the electromagnetic universe we think we comprehend still contains zones of silence, zones of strangeness, zones where the normal rules are suspended or altered, and where we're forced to confront how little we actually understand about the fundamental forces and fields that we've built our entire technological civilization upon. Forces that work perfectly nearly everywhere, but that in certain locations, like the zone of silence, behave in ways that remind us that our understanding is incomplete, that nature still holds surprises, that there are places on Earth where silence reigns, not because no one speaks, but because speaking doesn't propagate, where isolation is enforced not by distance, but by the failure of the electromagnetic medium that connects the rest of the world, where the zone of silence lives up to its name, either through geological accident that creates unusual but natural conditions, or through something stranger, something that makes it not just unusual, but genuinely anomalous. Not just difficult, but impossible, according to physics, as we currently understand it, leaving the zone as it has always been: silent, strange, significant, suspended between explanation and mystery, between science and legend, between the desert it occupies and the electromagnetic void it allegedly creates, where communication fails, where compasses spin, where the zone of silence earns its name every day. Either through effects we could explain if we studied carefully enough, with proper equipment and rigorous methodology, or through effects that would require us to rewrite our understanding of how electromagnetic fields work, how radio propagates, how reality itself functions in this specific patch of Mexican desert that has defied complete explanation despite decades of investigation, that continues to attract curiosity and speculation, and visitors who want to experience the silence, who want to test their equipment, who want to stand in a place where the modern world's invisible infrastructure allegedly stops working, and where you're forced to confront what remains when the technological mediation is removed, when silence isn't metaphor, but is actual, when the zone earns its name because the electromagnetic radiation that carries information and connects humans and enables navigation simply doesn't propagate normally there, either because of magnetic minerals and radio absorption, creating difficult but comprehensible conditions, or because of something stranger, something unexplained, something that makes the zone of silence more than unusual geology and transforms it into genuine mystery, into place where reality doesn't quite follow the rules, where the silence is deep and strange and real. The Tunguska event. Did something explode or something land? On the morning of June 30th, 1908, something entered the atmosphere over Siberia and detonated with a force estimated at 10 to 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion occurred near the Stony Tunguska River in a remote, sparsely populated region of Russia, flattening approximately 80 million trees across 800 square miles of forest, the blast pattern radiating outward from the epicenter, like a massive butterfly wing of destruction visible from aerial photographs decades later. Witnesses from settlements up to 400 miles away reported seeing a column of blue light nearly as bright as the sun moving across the sky, followed by a flash and shock wave that shattered windows, knocked people off their feet, and was detected by seismographs across Europe and Asia. Yet when investigators finally reached the site nearly 2 decades later, the remoteness and political turmoil of revolutionary Russia delayed systematic study. They found something deeply puzzling: no impact crater. Despite the massive explosion, despite the devastation spread across hundreds of square miles, there was no crater, no obvious point of impact, no meteorite fragments in quantities that would explain an explosion of that magnitude. The trees at ground zero remained standing, stripped of branches and bark, but upright like telephone poles, while trees further out were flattened in a radial pattern, pointing away from the blast center. It looked like an airburst, like something had exploded above the ground rather than hitting it. But if it was a meteor or comet, as conventional explanations propose, why did it explode in the air instead of cratering the ground? And where did all the material go? Or is the lack of crater evidence not that something exploded, but that something landed? That whatever came down over Tunguska wasn't a natural object following ballistic trajectory, but something else? Something that decelerated or maneuvered, that touched down rather than impacting, that left minimal physical trace because it wasn't destroyed but rather remained intact and possibly even departed, leaving behind only the evidence of its passage and the massive energy release that accompanied whatever actually occurred in that remote Siberian forest on a summer morning over a century ago. The conventional explanation that has achieved scientific consensus is that a stony asteroid or comet approximately 50 to 60 meters in diameter entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded at an altitude of roughly 5 to 10 kilometers due to the immense stresses of atmospheric entry. The object was traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, and as it penetrated deeper into the atmosphere, The air pressure building up in front of it created forces that exceeded the structural integrity of the rock or ice, causing it to fragment and then explode, releasing its kinetic energy in a massive airburst. The energy equivalent of 10 to 15 megatons detonated in the air, rather than on the ground, which is why there's no crater, but why the damage pattern matches nuclear airburst testing, pressure waves radiating outward, thermal effects scorching vegetation, the blast strong enough to topple trees for dozens of miles. The lack of significant meteorite fragments is explained by the object being relatively fragile, possibly a comet made largely of ice and dust that vaporized almost completely in the explosion, leaving only microscopic particles dispersed over wide areas, rather than large chunks that could be easily identified and recovered. This explanation accounts for most of the observed phenomena and is supported by computer modeling that can reproduce the observed damage pattern using asteroid airburst scenarios. It's scientifically respectable, consistent with our understanding of meteor physics, and doesn't require invoking exotic possibilities. For mainstream science, Tunguska is solved. It was a natural cosmic impact, rare and dramatic, but ultimately comprehensible within existing frameworks. Yet questions persist that keep alternative theories alive more than a century after the event. The composition and trajectory raise issues. If it was a stony asteroid, some fragments should have survived to reach the ground. Asteroid material is typically more durable than the complete vaporization scenario requires. If it was a comet, the low density and high ice content make it more likely to explode at high altitude. But comets approaching from deep space should have trajectories that are more steeply angled than what witnesses described. The object that entered the atmosphere over Tunguska was described as coming in at a relatively shallow angle, more consistent with something that was maneuvering or that had already been captured into Earth orbit, rather than plunging in from interplanetary space. Witnesses reported that the object's path changed direction during its approach, that it wasn't following a simple ballistic curve, but appeared to be under some form of control or exhibiting aerodynamic behavior that shouldn't occur with a meteor. The trees standing at ground zero, while trees further out were flattened, is geometrically consistent with an airburst, but is also one of the elements that has fueled speculation about something landing rather than exploding. If the blast occurred directly above, the pressure wave would radiate outward horizontally at ground level, flattening trees in all directions except immediately below the burst point where the force was directed downward rather than laterally. This matches airburst physics perfectly, but it also matches what you might expect if something descended vertically, creating downward force that left the trees at the center, standing while the landing, or hovering, created outward forces that flattened the surrounding forest. The distinction between these scenarios is subtle, but significant. One involves destruction of the object. The other involves a controlled approach. Anomalous radioactivity has been reported in the region, though the data is contested and complicated by later Soviet nuclear testing in the area. Some researchers claim elevated radiation levels and unusual isotope ratios in soil samples from the epicenter that don't match normal background or fallout from later nuclear tests, suggesting that whatever occurred at Tunguska involved energetic processes that left radioactive signatures. This could be consistent with a natural impact if the object contained unusual compositions, or if the explosion created conditions that synthesized radioactive isotopes. Or it could suggest something involving nuclear processes or exotic energy sources that wouldn't be present in a simple meteor explosion. Accelerated tree growth in the years following 1908 has been documented, with trees that survived the blast showing growth rings indicating abnormally rapid development for decades after the event. Some interpret this as consistent with radiation exposure or other environmental changes that stimulated growth. Others suggest it simply reflects reduced competition. So many trees were destroyed that survivors had access to more resources and grew faster. But the pattern and duration of the enhanced growth have characteristics that some researchers find unusual compared to what would be expected from simply removing competition. The magnetic anomalies reported in the area add another layer. Compass deviations and unusual magnetic field readings have been documented around the epicenter. Though again, these are difficult to attribute definitively because the region's geology and later human activity could explain the anomalies. If they're connected to the Tunguska event, they might suggest the object had unusual magnetic properties, or that the explosion created conditions that altered the magnetic field in lasting ways, or they might be entirely unrelated and coincidental. The lack of a debris field proportionate to the explosion's magnitude is the element that troubles some investigators most acutely. Microparticles have been found that could be from the impactor, but the total mass recovered is far less than what an object capable of producing a 15 megaton explosion should have contained. If the object was 50 to 60 meters in diameter, with composition similar to known asteroids, even near complete vaporization should have left more residue than has been detected. Either the object was far less massive than calculations suggest, which would mean it was traveling impossibly fast to produce the observed energy release, or much of the mass somehow didn't vaporize, in which case, where did it go? This is where the landing theory gains traction among those unsatisfied with conventional explanations. If something came down at Tunguska that wasn't destroyed, if it was a craft that decelerated and landed or hovered, releasing energy in the process but remaining largely intact, then the lack of massive debris makes sense. The object wouldn't have vaporized because it wasn't moving at meteor speeds by the time it reached the surface, wasn't destroyed by impact because it made a controlled approach, and left no crater because it didn't crash, but rather set down. The energy release might have been engines or systems creating the deceleration. A massive energy expenditure that flattened the surrounding forest as a side effect of whatever propulsion or energy manipulation technology the craft employed. The immediate response by Tsarist authorities was limited due to the remoteness and the political instability that would soon erupt into revolution and civil war. But there are accounts of expeditions sent to the area in the years immediately following the event that reported unusual findings before systematic scientific investigation began. These early accounts mentioned strange objects or structures glimpsed in the forest, lights seen in the region at night, and locals reporting unusual phenomena in the years following the explosion. The reliability of these accounts is questionable. They're fragmentary, secondhand, and filtered through nearly a century of retelling. But they suggest that even before scientific consensus formed around the meteor explanation, there was speculation and observation suggesting something anomalous might have remained in the area. The first major scientific expedition in 1927, led by Leonid Kulik, found the devastated forest but no crater, which Kulik initially found baffling because he was expecting to find meteorite impact evidence. He spent years returning to the site, excavating, searching for fragments, trying to understand how such a massive explosion could occur without leaving the physical evidence he expected. He died before the airburst explanation became widely accepted, and some of his later writings suggest he was becoming less convinced that a simple meteor explained everything he observed. He noted anomalies in the blast pattern, unusual soil characteristics, and witness accounts that didn't quite fit the straightforward impact scenario. Soviet interest in the site intensified during the Cold War, partly because understanding large explosions had obvious military relevance, and partly because the absence of a crater and the airburst characteristics made Tunguska useful for studying the effects of nuclear detonations without actually detonating nuclear weapons in remote areas. Extensive surveys were conducted, and much of the data remains classified or was classified for decades, leading to speculation that something significant was found that wasn't made public. Conspiracy theorists suggest the Soviets recovered technology or materials from the site that they kept secret, either because it was extraterrestrial or because it represented advanced terrestrial technology that had been lost or kept hidden. The extraterrestrial craft theory proposes several scenarios. In one version, an alien spacecraft suffered a catastrophic failure and exploded as it attempted to land or pass through the atmosphere, explaining the airburst characteristics while accounting for the lack of normal meteor composition. In another version, the craft was deliberately destroyed, either by its occupants preventing it from falling into primitive human hands, or by defensive systems from another group preventing the craft from landing. The most intriguing version suggests the craft successfully landed or hovered, discharged whatever occupants or cargo it carried, and then departed, with the explosion being either a side effect of its engines during the landing, departure sequence, or a deliberate destruction of the landing site to remove evidence of the visit. The antimatter theory is occasionally proposed, suggesting that a chunk of antimatter from space entered the atmosphere and annihilated upon contact with normal matter, producing the massive energy release with no residue because matter, antimatter. Annihilation converts mass entirely to energy. This would explain the explosion magnitude, the lack of debris, and potentially some of the unusual effects reported. However, antimatter doesn't naturally accumulate into chunks large enough to produce these effects, and it's unclear how such an object would survive traveling through space without encountering normal matter and annihilating long before reaching Earth. Black hole or strange matter theories venture into even more exotic physics, proposing that a micro black hole or strange matter object passed through Earth at Tunguska, releasing energy during its interaction with normal matter, but continuing through the planet and exiting on the other side, explaining why no crater or residue was left. These theories are scientifically dubious because such objects should have different observable effects than what was witnessed, but they demonstrate the range of explanations that have been proposed, attempting to account for the Tunguska anomalies. The witness accounts are extensive and come from multiple sources: indigenous Evenki people who lived in the region, Russian settlers in nearby towns, travelers who were in the area, creating a substantial testimonial record despite the remoteness. These accounts describe the object's appearance as bright blue or white, moving across the sky, sometimes described as cylindrical or cigar-shaped, rather than the expected meteor point of light. The descriptions of the explosion's effects, the heat wave, the shock wave, the column of fire and smoke rising to enormous height, are consistent across witnesses. But some accounts include details that don't fit simple meteor impact: the object changing direction during flight, hovering or slowing before the explosion, making sounds before impact that meteors don't typically produce because they're traveling supersonically ahead of their own sound. The indigenous Evenki have legends about the event that have been passed down orally. Some of these legends describe the visitor from the sky as a god or spirit, as punishment for human transgressions, or as the arrival of something powerful and not of this world. The interpretation of these legends is complicated by the fact that they were collected decades after the event and filtered through translation and cultural frameworks, but they consistently describe the event as extraordinary, as something that changed the land and that continues to have significance in local consciousness. Some Evenki refused to approach the epicenter for years, claiming the area was cursed or that something dangerous remained there. Modern expeditions continued to visit the site, using increasingly sophisticated equipment to search for anomalies, to measure radiation and magnetic fields, to sample soil and vegetation for unusual compositions. The site has become a destination for both scientific investigation and alternative research groups looking for evidence of something beyond conventional explanation. Each expedition seems to find enough to maintain their preferred interpretation, while failing to find definitive proof that would settle the question conclusively. The fact that Tunguska remains debated more than a century later, despite extensive study and the availability of modern analytical techniques, suggests either that the conventional explanation is correct, but the evidence has been degraded by time and later contamination, or that the conventional explanation is incomplete, and something genuinely anomalous occurred that we lack the framework to properly interpret. The remoteness that delayed initial investigation also makes it impossible to go back and gather the pristine evidence that might have existed immediately after the event, when whatever occurred was fresh and hadn't been complicated by a century of environmental changes, nuclear testing fallout, industrial development, and repeated human expeditions contaminating the site. What we know for certain is that something released massive energy over the Tunguska region in 1908, that the explosion flattened forests and was detected across a substantial portion of the planet, and that whatever caused it left minimal physical trace despite the magnitude of the event. Whether this represents a well-understood natural phenomenon, asteroid or comet airburst, or something else, something that involved a craft that landed or attempted to land, something that was destroyed or that destroyed evidence of its presence, something that represents contact with non-human intelligence or technology, remains contested. The lack of crater continues to be the central mystery, the element that can be explained through airburst physics, but that also allows alternative interpretations to persist, that keeps the question open despite scientific consensus claiming it's resolved. Tunguska stands as one of the most powerful unexplained events in modern history. A massive explosion that occurred in a remote location where investigation was delayed long enough that crucial evidence was lost, leaving us with a scenario where multiple explanations can be constructed from the remaining data, but none can be proven with absolute certainty. Whether the sky opened and dropped a rock that exploded, or whether something else came down over that Siberian forest, something that maneuvered and landed and possibly even departed, something that flattened trees and released enormous energy, not from destruction, but from operation, something that we lack the framework to properly identify, because we're still assuming cosmic impacts when the evidence might actually be suggesting visitation, remains one of those questions where the official answer satisfies most, but where the anomalies trouble those who look closely, where the lack of crater echoes like an empty space in the center of the devastation, an absence that might be exactly what you'd expect if something didn't crash and explode, but rather arrived and landed and left the forest flattened not from impact, but from the presence of something from elsewhere, something that came down over Tunguska on June 30th, 1908, and left behind enough questions to fuel speculation for a century, enough mystery to ensure that the event remains not a solved historical curiosity, but an ongoing debate about what actually happened, whether something exploded or something landed, whether Tunguska represents natural cosmic violence or artificial controlled descent, whether we're looking at a rock that vaporized or a craft that didn't, and whether the absence of a crater is proof that an airburst occurred or evidence that something came down and walked away, leaving the forest destroyed but taking itself with it, vanishing back into the sky or underground or into whatever space it came from, leaving Tunguska as a scar on the landscape and a permanent question mark in the history of unexplained phenomena, an event that was witnessed but never fully understood, documented but never definitively explained, investigated but never truly solved, despite official assurances that we know what happened, that it was just a meteor, just a cosmic accident, just natural forces doing what natural forces do. When the evidence, if you look at it with questions rather than answers in mind, if you wonder about the absence instead of just accepting the explanation for it, suggests that maybe what came down over Tunguska wasn't destroyed at all, wasn't a victim of atmospheric forces it couldn't survive, but rather was something that intended to be there, that chose that location, that came down under control, and left under control, and left behind only the mystery, only the flattened forest, only the energy signature, only the lack of crater that conventional wisdom explains with airburst physics. But that might alternatively be explained by something that never crashed because it never intended to. That came down over Tunguska for purposes we'll never know, unless it comes back, unless whatever was there in 1908 returns, and we finally understand that the absence of crater was never the puzzle requiring explanation, but rather the clue revealing what actually happened, that something landed, that something was there, that something came down and possibly left and took with it the answers, leaving us only questions that persist across more than a century since that morning when the sky over Siberia opened and released something into the forest, something that changed the land and puzzles us still. Time slips, walking into different eras without warning. You're walking down a familiar street in a city you know well, maybe heading to work or running errands on an ordinary afternoon, when something shifts. The quality of light changes. The sounds around you become different. No car engines, no electronic hum, just horses and wooden wheels on cobblestone you didn't realize was under the asphalt. The buildings look the same, but different, cleaner, or older. Architectural details that were renovated now appear in their original state. And the people you pass are dressed in clothing from another era, walking with purpose and paying you no attention, as if you're the one who doesn't belong. You've stepped into the past, or a version of it, without transition or warning, without crossing any obvious threshold, except continuing to walk forward on a street that somehow became a corridor through time. These moments last seconds or minutes before reality snaps back, before the cobblestones become asphalt again and the Victorian pedestrians dissolve into modern crowds, leaving you standing disoriented on a street that looks exactly as it should, but that you know for certain was different just moments before, was occupied by a different era, was showing you a window into time that shouldn't be accessible just by walking down an ordinary sidewalk on an ordinary day. These are time slips, and they've been reported throughout history by credible witnesses whose accounts can't be easily dismissed as hallucination or fabrication. The experiences share consistent characteristics. They happen spontaneously without warning or intention. They involve ordinary locations becoming portals to the past. They include sensory details far beyond what imagination or daydreaming typically provides. And they end abruptly, snapping back to the present with jarring suddenness that leaves witnesses certain something genuine occurred. Something that briefly allowed them access to time that wasn't their own, to moments that already happened being somehow accessible again, as if the past doesn't actually disappear, but continues existing in layers that occasionally become visible when conditions align in ways we don't understand. The most famous documented case occurred in 1901, when two Oxford academics, Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, visited the Palace of Versailles and experienced what they later realized was a time slip into the late 18th century. They described walking through the gardens and encountering people in period costume that they initially assumed were historical reenactors or staff in costume. But the details were wrong for intentional recreation. The clothing was weathered and authentic. The faces of the people they saw had an immediacy and presence that performers don't convey. The atmosphere of the location felt different in ways that went beyond visual appearance. They saw buildings and landscape features that no longer existed in 1901, but that historical records confirmed had been present in Marie Antoinette's time. They saw a woman they believed was Marie Antoinette herself, sketching in the gardens, dressed in summer clothing from the 1780s, completely unaware of their presence or seemingly existing in her own time while they observed from theirs. The two women didn't initially realize they'd experienced something impossible. It was only when they compared notes and researched the history of Versailles that they understood the people and buildings they'd seen shouldn't have been there, that they'd somehow walked into August 1789, seeing the palace grounds as they existed just before the Revolution, overlapping with that time period while remaining physically present in 1901. Their account, published as an adventure, was rigorously detailed and included specific observations that matched historical records they couldn't have known without extensive research, suggesting they actually saw the past rather than hallucinating or confabulating details. Time slips often occur in locations with significant historical weight, places where major events occurred, or where the past feels particularly present. Battlefields, old buildings, historic districts. These are common settings, as if locations can somehow retain or replay the past, as if time doesn't flow uniformly, but pools and eddies in places where human experience was particularly intense or significant. Gettysburg has numerous reports of people seeing soldiers in period uniforms, hearing cannon fire and musket shots, smelling gunpowder and the specific atmosphere of battle before everything returns to the quiet tourist site it currently is. The Tower of London, Hampton Court, countless English castles and manor houses have accounts of visitors walking into rooms that appear as they did centuries ago, encountering people in period dress going about their daily activities, experiencing complete sensory immersion in the past for minutes before the scene dissolves. But time slips also occur in ordinary locations with no particular historical significance, suggesting the phenomenon isn't solely about places retaining the past, but about time itself being less linear and separated than we assume. A woman in Liverpool in 1996 walked down a familiar shopping street and found herself in the 1950s. The storefronts changed. The cars were vintage models that looked new. The people wore 50s fashions, and she stood there watching this scene unfold around her before a van drove through the vision, and she was back in the present. She provided specific details about store names and locations that she later verified through historical research had actually existed in that exact location in the 50s. Details she had no way of knowing before her experience. The Bold Street area in Liverpool has become known for time slip frequency, with multiple independent reports from different people describing similar experiences of the street, appearing as it did in different decades. The consistency of location suggests that some places might be more prone to the phenomenon, that geographic or electromagnetic conditions could create circumstances where temporal boundaries become permeable. Or perhaps the concentration of reports creates its own effect, awareness and expectation, making people more likely to notice and interpret unusual experiences as time slips when they occur in known hotspots. The sensory completeness of time slips is what distinguishes them from simple visual hallucinations or false memories. Witnesses describe not just seeing the past, but experiencing it through all senses. Sounds are different. The acoustic environment changes from modern urban noise to whatever sounds characterize the period they've slipped into. Smells are period appropriate. The air quality feels different, sometimes cleaner if slipping into pre-industrial times, or filled with smoke and animal odors, if experiencing eras when those were common urban characteristics. The light has different quality, natural sunlight unfiltered by modern pollution, or the specific amber tones from gas streetlights in Victorian slips. The temperature and humidity can differ from what they were moments before. This multisensory immersion suggests either elaborate hallucination involving multiple brain systems simultaneously, or actual physical displacement into conditions that match the past. The people encountered during time slips typically don't acknowledge the witness's presence. They go about their activities as if the modern person isn't there, as if they exist in their own time, and the witness is observing without being able to interact. Occasionally, however, there are reports of brief interaction, eye contact with someone from the past, a nod of acknowledgement, even brief conversation before the witness realizes the person they're speaking to is dressed in clothing from a different era and speaking with vocabulary and accent patterns that don't match the present. These interactive slips are rarer and more disturbing because they suggest not just one-way viewing of the past, but actual overlap. Moments when two time periods are simultaneously present and people from each can perceive each other. There are also reverse time slips, accounts from historical records where people described encountering individuals dressed strangely, speaking in unfamiliar ways, seeming confused about their surroundings before vanishing. If time slips work in both directions, if the past occasionally becomes visible to people in the present, then the present must occasionally become visible to people in the past. Medieval chronicles mention strangers appearing and disappearing, people wearing clothing of unknown style, who spoke languages that weren't quite right, who asked questions about locations and dates, as if confused about when and where they were. Could these have been time slippers from the future, our present, briefly visible in the past before snapping back to their proper time? The mechanism that might cause time slips remains purely speculative. Quantum physics suggests time might not be the simple, linear progression we experience consciously, that all moments might exist simultaneously in some framework, with consciousness moving through them sequentially, but the actual structure of space-time containing past, present, and future as coexisting states. If this is true, then time slips might be moments when consciousness accidentally accesses a time period it's not supposed to be experiencing, when the normal constraints that keep awareness locked to the present moment briefly fail, allowing perception of the past as if it were present, because at some fundamental level, it still is present, still exists in the structure of space-time, even though our consciousness has moved past it. Electromagnetic anomalies have been proposed as potential triggers. If certain electromagnetic field configurations can affect consciousness or perception, then walking into an area with unusual EM characteristics might shift awareness in ways that allow access to past time states. This would explain why some locations have repeated time slip reports. They have persistent EM conditions that repeatedly create the circumstances allowing temporal displacement. It would also explain the spontaneity. You don't need to do anything special, just be in the right location when conditions align. There are also theories involving parallel timelines or dimensions where the past never ended but continues on separate tracks. What we experience as time slips might be moments when barriers between timelines thin, when we briefly perceive parallel realities where time progresses differently, or where the past is still actively occurring. We step into a dimension where it's still 1880 or 1950. Observe it briefly, then return to our own timeline. This framework explains why the past we see is active and living, rather than static recording. It's not memory or replay, but actual ongoing reality in another dimensional stream. The psychological impact on witnesses is significant and consistent. Time slips produce profound disorientation and often existential crisis. If you can walk into the past without warning, what does that mean about the nature of time and reality? If the past still exists and can be accessed accidentally, then is it truly past? Or are all times somehow present, and we're simply limited to experiencing one slice at a time? Witnesses report spending weeks or months trying to rationalize their experience, researching the historical period they witnessed, trying to find logical explanations before ultimately accepting that they experienced something that shouldn't be possible according to conventional understanding of how time works. Some people experience repeated time slips as if having one makes additional episodes more likely. They report becoming sensitive to the feeling that precedes a slip, a quality to the air or light that signals transition is about to occur, a sensation of unreality or displacement that gives them seconds of warning before the present disappears and the past becomes visible. These repeat experiencers sometimes describe feeling unstuck in time, as if their consciousness doesn't anchor properly to the present anymore, as if they're always slightly at risk of sliding into past moments, existing at the boundary between times, rather than securely locked in the current moment. Children seem to experience time slips more frequently than adults, or at least report them more innocently. A child will describe playing in the yard and suddenly seeing different houses, different people, everything looking old-fashioned before returning to normal. Adults dismiss these as imagination, but the specificity of details children provide sometimes matches historical facts about the location that the child wouldn't have known. Are children's perceptions more flexible, less rigidly locked to consensus reality, making them more likely to slip between times? Or do adults experience them just as frequently, but rationalize and dismiss the experiences rather than reporting them? The duration of time slips varies dramatically. Some last only seconds, a flicker where the street looks different for an instant before returning to normal. Others persist for minutes, giving the witness time to walk through the altered environment, observe details, even panic about being trapped in the past before the transition reverses. There are very rare accounts of time slips lasting hours, where the person becomes convinced they've actually traveled in time and may not be able to return, only to eventually snap back to the present exhausted and disoriented, having experienced what felt like half a day in the past. The question of whether physical time travel is occurring, or whether time slips are purely perceptual, consciousness accessing past sensory information without the body actually displacing, remains unresolved. Witnesses feel physically present in the past, can touch objects and surfaces that appear aged or different, can feel temperature and air quality that match the period. But they don't interact meaningfully with the environment, don't leave traces, don't affect the past in observable ways. It's possible they're experiencing perfect hallucination that includes tactile and proprioceptive elements. Or it's possible they're genuinely physically present, but in a state that doesn't allow them to causally interact, like ghosts of the future observing but not participating. Photography during time slips occasionally captures anomalies, images that show period details that weren't visible to the naked eye, or that show the location looking as it does currently, with no evidence of the historical scene the photographer claims to have been witnessing. This suggests the time slip might be consciousness level, rather than affecting physical light and camera sensors. That the brain is generating the experience from accessing temporal information somehow, while the actual physical light reaching the eyes and the camera remains contemporary. Or it suggests that cameras don't see across time the way human consciousness can under the right conditions. Skeptics attribute time slips to temporal lobe epilepsy, microsleep dream states, confabulation where imagination and research combine to create false memories of experiencing the past, or simple misinterpretation of reenactors or film sets. Some of these explanations work for individual cases. Certainly some reports are misidentifications or psychological experiences, rather than genuine temporal displacement. But the consistency across centuries of reports, the specific historical details witnesses provide without having researched them, the multiple witnesses occasionally experiencing the same slip simultaneously, and the sheer strangeness of the phenomenon being so consistent despite coming from people across cultures and time periods suggests that at least some percentage of reports represent something genuinely anomalous. Multiple witnesses experiencing the same time slipped together is particularly evidential. When two people walking together both see the same scene from the past, both describe the same details, both experience the same disorientation when it ends, the shared experience rules out individual hallucination or psychological aberration. The Versailles case involved two witnesses. Several Liverpool Bold Street reports involve pairs or groups seeing the same temporal displacement. If time slips are purely neurological misfiring, they shouldn't be contagious or shared. If they represent actual perceptual access to the past, then multiple people in proximity should be able to access it simultaneously, which matches the evidence. The implications of time slips, if they're genuine, are staggering for physics and philosophy. They suggest time isn't the unidirectional flow we experience consciously, but something more complex, possibly all at once, from perspectives outside of time, possibly composed of layers or streams that can overlap, possibly accessible in non-linear ways under conditions we don't understand. They suggest the past doesn't cease to exist, but remains present in some form, either as information encoded in space-time that can be accessed, or as ongoing reality in parallel dimensions. They suggest consciousness might not be as locked to the present moment as we assume, that awareness can potentially access temporal locations outside the current moment under the right circumstances. For those who've experienced time slips, the philosophical implications matter less than the immediate certainty that they've witnessed something impossible. They were walking down a street, and suddenly that street was a different time, was populated by people from the past going about their lives, was fully realized and completely real for seconds or minutes before dissolving back into the present. They can't prove it happened beyond their testimony, can't usually produce evidence beyond their detailed descriptions, but they know what they experienced wasn't dream or hallucination or imagination. It was perception of the past, access to time that already occurred but somehow hadn't disappeared, had remained accessible through a mechanism we don't understand and can't control, presenting itself without invitation to ordinary people during ordinary activities, proving that the boundaries we assume separate past from present might be far more permeable than physics currently acknowledges. And somewhere right now, someone is walking down a familiar street when the light changes quality, when the sounds shift to horses and cartwheels, when the people around them suddenly wear clothing from a different century, when they realize without understanding how or why that they've stepped out of their own time into the past. Walking through a moment that already happened, being somehow made present again, living in overlap between eras that should be separated by decades or centuries, but that for these brief, inexplicable moments exist simultaneously in the same space, accessible to consciousness that has accidentally found the seam between times, the crack in temporal structure through which the past becomes visible, before reality corrects itself, and their return to the present, standing disoriented on a street that looks exactly as it should, but that they know for certain was different just seconds before, was showing them time that shouldn't be accessible, but was, leaving them forever changed by the certainty that the past hasn't disappeared at all, but continues existing somewhere we can't normally reach, waiting in the layers of time, occasionally becoming visible when conditions align to create those impossible moments when walking forward through space somehow becomes walking backward through time, allowing us glimpses of what was, reminding us that everything we think we understand about time might be comfortable fiction, and that reality is far stranger, far more fluid, far more accessible across its temporal dimensions than our everyday experience suggests, waiting for the next time slip to prove it again to the next person who walks unsuspecting through a door into a different era, and realizes too late that time isn't what we've been taught, isn't linear and irreversible and neatly partitioned, but something else entirely, something that allows the past to reach forward and touch us, allows us to reach backward and see it, creating moments of impossible overlap that change everyone who experiences them, leaving them certain of something they can never prove but can never doubt, that they've walked through time and returned, that they've seen what shouldn't be visible, that the past is still there, still happening, still accessible, waiting in the structure of reality for the next crack to open and pull someone through. Black-eyed children, entities that knock on doors at night. There's a knock on your door late at night, hours after any reasonable person would be making social calls, when the neighborhood is dark and silent and you're preparing for bed. You weren't expecting anyone. You approach cautiously, look through the peephole or window, and see children standing on your porch. They're young, maybe 10 to 14 years old, dressed normally, standing still with an unnatural patience that immediately feels wrong. Something about them triggers every instinct to not open that door, to pretend you're not home, to back away quietly. But they knock again, and when you get a better look at their faces, when light catches their eyes, you realize why your nervous system is screaming danger. Their eyes are completely black. No whites, no iris, no pupil you can distinguish from the surrounding darkness. Just solid black from edge to edge, like someone filled the eye sockets with ink or cut holes through their faces into an empty void. These are the black-eyed children, and according to hundreds of encounters reported over the past 3 decades, if you make the mistake of inviting them inside, something terrible happens that survivors struggle to articulate, something that changes you in ways that can't be easily explained or undone. The phenomenon entered widespread awareness in 1998 when journalist Brian Bethel posted his encounter to an internet forum. He'd been sitting in his parked car in Abilene, Texas, writing a check when he noticed 2 boys approaching. They were dressed in hoodies, appearing about 10 and 14 years old, moving toward his vehicle with deliberate purpose. When they reached his window, the older one asked for a ride home, explaining they wanted to see a movie but had left their money at home and needed to retrieve it. The request was innocuous enough, but Bethel described overwhelming terror flooding through him for no reason he could identify. Something was catastrophically wrong. Then he looked at their eyes, completely black, both children, solid darkness, where eyes should show white and color. He felt compelled to unlock the door despite his terror, his hand actually moving toward the lock as if someone else was controlling it, while the older child became more insistent. "We can't come in unless you let us. Let us in. We need to come in." Bethel snapped out of the compulsion, started his car, and drove away, while the children watched expressionlessly. No disappointment or anger showing on their faces, just blank observation as he escaped. Since Bethel's account, hundreds of similar reports have surfaced from around the world, sharing disturbing consistency despite coming from people who've never communicated, who live in different countries, who have no apparent connection except the experience of being approached by children with completely black eyes. The encounters follow patterns that suggest this isn't random hallucination or individual psychological breakdown, but something actually occurring, some phenomenon that manifests through these child forms to interact with humans in ways that serve purposes we don't understand and probably shouldn't. The children always appear in pairs or small groups, never alone. They're typically between ages 10 and 17 in appearance, though their behavior suggests they're not actually children despite the forms they wear. They dress in ordinary clothing, jeans, hoodies, t-shirts, nothing that would draw attention or mark them as unusual except for their eyes. Their skin is often described as waxy or pale, with texture that doesn't quite look alive. though this isn't always obvious until you're close enough that backing away becomes difficult. They appear at doors, usually at night, but sometimes during twilight hours, knocking persistently with a rhythm that witnesses describe as mechanical, as if they're performing a gesture they've observed but don't fully understand. The requests they make are always variations on the same theme. They need to come inside. They need a phone to call their parents. They need a ride somewhere. They need help. The specific excuse varies, but the underlying demand is consistent. You must invite them in. You must grant them access. You must open the barrier that separates them from your space. And critically, they can't or won't enter without permission. This limitation appears absolute across all reported encounters. They can ask, they can pressure, they can use compulsion techniques that make you feel you should let them in, but they cannot cross the threshold uninvited. Something prevents them, some rule they're bound by, that might be their only weakness. The compulsion aspect is what makes encounters so dangerous. Multiple witnesses describe feeling an overwhelming urge to comply with the children's requests, despite every rational instinct screaming not to. It's not that the children are particularly persuasive in any normal sense. Their speech is often flat and repetitive, lacking the natural emotional cadence human children use when asking for help. But something about their presence affects decision-making, creates an almost hypnotic pressure to do what they ask. People find their hands moving toward door locks, their mouths forming words of agreement, their bodies responding to instructions their minds are desperately trying to reject. The compulsion isn't perfect. People do resist it, do manage to refuse entry and close doors, or drive away. But it requires active effort, conscious fight against something that wants you to surrender your will and let them in. What happens if you do let them in is where accounts become fragmented and disturbing. Very few people who've granted access have come forward with detailed reports, which might mean they're too traumatized to discuss it. They don't remember what occurred, or they didn't survive the encounter in ways that allow them to report. The secondhand accounts and partial testimonies that do exist describe rapid deterioration of the person who invited them inside. They become withdrawn, terrified to be alone, reporting that the children didn't leave, that they're still in the house somehow, even though they're not visible. They develop physical symptoms, extreme fatigue, nosebleeds, bruising without cause. Some claim they wake up in different locations than where they fell asleep, with missing time they can't account for. Others report that the children visit them repeatedly now, appearing in their homes without knocking, standing at the foot of their beds at night, following them through daily life, just at the edge of vision. The black eyes themselves are beyond unnatural. They're not contact lenses or makeup. Witnesses who see them up close describe them as impossibly dark, as if you're looking into depth rather than at a surface, as if the eyes are holes that go somewhere else. Some report seeing movement in the blackness, shapes or shadows shifting as if things are moving in the depths. Others describe the eyes as reflective in ways that don't match physics, catching light strangely or seeming to emit their own faint luminescence. Looking into them creates profound psychological distress, as if you're making eye contact with something that understands you completely, that sees through every defense and pretense, that recognizes your food or prey or resource, and is patient enough to wait for you to make the mistake of granting access. Children are inherently trusted in most cultures. We're wired to respond to juvenile features with protection and assistance. The black-eyed children exploit this, using forms that should trigger helping behavior while radiating enough wrongness that the conflict between instinct to help and instinct to flee creates paralysis. This might be the point. The confusion and cognitive dissonance weaken decision-making, make people more susceptible to the compulsion, increase the likelihood they'll make the fatal mistake of opening the door or unlocking the car, despite knowing at some level that they absolutely shouldn't. The locations of encounters vary but show some patterns. Residential doorsteps at night are most common, suggesting the entities specifically target people in their homes, in spaces where they feel safe and are less guarded. But encounters also occur in parked cars, at gas stations, in hotels. Anywhere someone is in a contained space that requires granting access. The children adapt their requests to the situation. At a house, they need to use your phone. In a car, they need a ride. At a hotel, they've locked themselves out of their room and need you to let them into yours to call their parents. The specificity of the request, tailored to the situation, suggests intelligence and intentionality, not random manifestation, but targeted approach. Some encounters include adults accompanying the black-eyed children, figures who also have the solid black eyes, but appear in adult forms. These are rarer in reports, but their presence suggests a hierarchy or organization, that the children might be the primary interface, but there are adult equivalents who sometimes accompany them or handle situations where child forms would be ineffective. This expands the phenomenon beyond just children to suggest a species or group that can manifest in multiple human age categories, always with the distinctive black eyes, always seeking invitation and access. The theories about what they are range across every framework humans use to explain the inexplicable. The supernatural interpretation identifies them as demons or malevolent spirits that require invitation to enter human spaces, bound by spiritual laws that prevent them from crossing thresholds without permission. The black eyes mark them as not human, as entities wearing human disguise imperfectly, getting most details right but failing at the eyes, which are supposedly windows to the soul and perhaps can't be faked by beings that don't have human souls. In this framework, inviting them in grants spiritual access, permission that allows them to attach to you, possess you, drain your life force, or claim some aspect of your being that they can't take without consent. The extraterrestrial theory suggests they're alien-human hybrids, beings created through genetic manipulation that blend alien genetics with human appearance. The black eyes might be their natural state, or might result from hybrid biology that doesn't quite work properly, leaving them with eyes that function but don't look right. They approach humans perhaps as part of ongoing study or resource extraction, needing voluntary access to implant monitoring devices, extract genetic material, or conduct experiments that require the subject's consent for reasons relating to universal laws or technological limitations we don't understand. Interdimensional theories propose they're beings from parallel realities that can briefly manifest in our dimension, but need human permission or interaction to stabilize their presence. The threshold between spaces, a doorway, a car door, any barrier that defines inside and outside, might represent the dimensional boundary they're trying to cross. And human consent somehow provides the energy or authorization needed for them to fully transition into our reality. The black eyes could be what happens when eyes from another dimension are viewed in ours, the appearance our brains generate when trying to process visual organs that don't properly translate into our physics. There are also darker theories suggesting government experimentation, children subjected to genetic or consciousness modification that left them changed, perhaps used as agents or weapons that exploit human compassion and trust. The black eyes might result from procedures that altered their neurology or installed technology that uses the eye sockets. They seek access to homes to gather intelligence, install surveillance, or test psychological weapons on unsuspecting populations. This frames them as victims and weapons simultaneously. Children who were human once, but have been transformed into something that serves purposes their handlers programmed into them. The vampiric parallel is obvious and perhaps intentional. Classic vampire mythology requires the creature to be invited across the threshold before it can enter and harm you. The Black-Eyed Children follow this same limitation, as if they're updated versions of that archetype, adapted for modern culture where vampires are romanticized rather than feared. By appearing as children, they bypass the adult threat presentation while maintaining the fundamental rules. They can pressure and compel, but the threshold holds unless you grant passage. And like vampires, the encounter doesn't end after they leave or you refuse them. There are reports of them returning night after night to the same location, knocking at the same door, making the same requests, wearing down resistance until the exhausted homeowner finally gives in, just to make it stop. Children also represent innocence lost or corrupted, and encounters with the Black-Eyed Children often leave witnesses with profound unease about children in general, about what might be hiding behind any young face, about whether the children they see in daily life are actually human, or might be more of these entities moving through society undetected. This psychological contamination might be part of the purpose, not just the immediate interaction, but the lasting damage to trust and certainty, the implanted doubt that spreads through communities as people share their experiences and start looking at every child with suspicion. The phenomenon has intensified with internet connectivity. More people are aware of Black-Eyed Children encounters. More reports surface and circulate, creating feedback loops where the phenomenon becomes more widely known and possibly more frequently experienced. This could be simply better reporting. Encounters that previously went undocumented or were dismissed as individual delusion now get shared and recognized as part of a pattern. Or it could be that awareness itself affects manifestation frequency, that these entities become more active or more able to manifest when more people believe in them, when the cultural consciousness creates space for them to exist. Skeptics argue the entire phenomenon is internet legend, creepypasta that people have internalized and now experience through false memories, sleep paralysis, hallucinations, or intentional hoaxes. The consistency of reports could reflect shared cultural narratives rather than shared encounters with actual entities. We're pattern-seeking creatures, and once a story template exists, we unconsciously shape ambiguous experiences to fit that template. A strange child at your door becomes a black-eyed child in memory, because that narrative is available and provides explanation for the unease you felt. But this explanation struggles with certain elements. The encounters include details witnesses didn't expect, reactions they didn't consciously control, physical effects that persist beyond the psychological. The compulsion to invite them in isn't something people report wanting to experience or believe they'd feel. The absolute nature of the threshold restriction across all reports suggests operational reality rather than narrative convention. And the fact that encounters continue to be reported by people who've never heard of the phenomenon until after their experience, who come to online communities searching for explanation for what happened to them and are shocked to find hundreds of similar accounts, indicates something beyond simple cultural transmission of folklore. What the Black-Eyed Children want, if they're real, remains unclear. Access is the immediate goal, but access to what and for what purpose? Do they feed on fear, on life energy, on something humans possess that they need? Are they collecting people, harvesting something from those who let them in? Are they scouts for invasion, testing human defenses and gathering intelligence? Are they lost, genuinely needing help, but unable to ask in ways that don't trigger terror, because their nature is so fundamentally different from ours that communication fails? The possibilities range from predatory to tragic, from malevolent to merely alien, and we have no way to determine which is accurate without taking the risk of letting them in and discovering firsthand what they do with the access we've granted. What's certain is that if you hear a knock at your door late at night, If you see children standing there with requests that don't quite make sense, if something makes you hesitate before opening that door, despite them being just kids who need help, trust that instinct absolutely. Look at their eyes. If they're black, solid black, with no white visible, do not open the door. Do not invite them in. Do not let them into your car. Do not grant any access to your space, no matter how much you feel compelled to help them, no matter how insistent they become, no matter how cruel it seems to refuse children in need. Because they're not children, not in any way that matters. And whatever they are has learned that appearing in child form with black eyes that suggest something wrong underneath gets them close enough to use compulsion and pressure, and that eventually, statistically, someone always opens the door, someone always lets them in, and those people either don't talk about what happened next or can't, leaving only gaps in the data where testimony should be, silence where there should be warning, and the black-eyed children standing patiently on another doorstep somewhere else, knocking with that mechanical rhythm, waiting for the next person to make the mistake of looking into those impossible eyes and feeling their hand moving toward the lock despite everything inside them, screaming to leave the door closed, to back away, to survive the encounter by refusing the one thing these entities need from you: permission to come inside. Polybius, the arcade game that drove players insane. In 1981, according to urban legend that emerged decades later, a mysterious arcade game called Polybius appeared in a handful of suburban Portland, Oregon locations, installed without fanfare or advertising, drawing players through word of mouth about its intensely addictive and disorienting gameplay. The game allegedly featured abstract vector graphics, psychedelic color patterns, and gameplay mechanics that were simultaneously compelling and disturbing, drawing players into extended sessions that left them experiencing severe psychological and physiological effects. Within weeks of playing Polybius, people reportedly suffered amnesia, night terrors, seizures, hallucinations, and profound aversion to video games in general, symptoms so severe that several players allegedly required hospitalization for psychiatric evaluation. The machines were supposedly monitored by men in black who would visit the arcade locations after hours, opening the cabinets not to collect quarters, but to retrieve data, as if the game itself was collecting information beyond high scores, as if player interactions were being studied for purposes the arcade owners didn't understand and weren't authorized to know. Then, after approximately 1 month of operation, the Polybius machines vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared, removed from all locations simultaneously, with the company allegedly responsible. Sinneslotion, a name that means sense deletion. In German, having no traceable existence, no business records, no other products, no employees who could be identified or interviewed. The game became legendary in retro gaming communities as the ultimate lost arcade cabinet, the subject of desperate searches by collectors and historians who found no physical evidence that Polybius ever existed. No ROM dumps, no circuit boards, no cabinets, no advertisements, no contemporary documentation from 1981 mentioning the game. Yet the legend persists with remarkable consistency across sources, creating the question of whether Polybius was a real psychological experiment disguised as entertainment, a government or military program testing subliminal messaging or consciousness manipulation through gaming platforms, or whether it's entirely fictional, an internet-age urban legend that has achieved such cultural penetration that people now remember or claim to have played a game that never existed, their memories constructed from the legend itself, rather than from actual experience, creating false recollection through the power of shared narrative, leaving Polybius as either the most successfully suppressed arcade game in history or the most successful fictional creation masquerading as suppressed history. A game that supposedly drove players insane, and that might itself be driving researchers and enthusiasts insane in their attempts to determine whether it was ever real. The timeline is crucial to understanding Polybius skepticism. The game allegedly appeared in 1981, but the first documented mention of it doesn't appear until 1998, when it was added to coinop.org, a website cataloging arcade games, listed as if it were a real title alongside genuinely documented games. The listing provided brief information about its existence and effects, but cited no sources, included no screenshots or technical specifications, and was added by an unknown contributor. From this single database entry, the legend spread through gaming forums, paranormal websites, and eventually mainstream internet culture, each retelling adding details and elaborations, until Polybius became one of the most famous lost arcade games, despite having no contemporary evidence of existence. The 17-year gap between alleged release and first documentation is the central problem. 1981 had active arcade gaming culture, enthusiast magazines, local news coverage of arcade trends and controversies. If a game had caused the dramatic effects attributed to Polybius, multiple hospitalizations, seizures, government agents monitoring machines, it would have generated contemporary news coverage, health warnings, investigations by consumer protection agencies. Arcade owners who installed machines causing such problems would have removed them and reported to distributors. Players who suffered would have sought legal recourse. Parents would have complained to authorities. Yet no contemporary newspaper articles, no health department records, no consumer complaints from 1981 mention anything resembling Polybius, suggesting either the story is entirely fabricated or the suppression was so complete and so effective that every piece of contemporary evidence was eliminated, which seems implausible given the number of independent parties who would have been involved. The name Polybius itself is interesting. It references the ancient Greek historian Polybius, who wrote extensively about Rome and who developed techniques for encoding secret messages. Naming a supposedly experimental mind control game after a historian associated with cryptography and hidden information might be intentional, meaningful choice by whoever created the game, or might be someone later creating the legend choosing a name that would add layers of significance and conspiratorial implication, making the game seem more sophisticated and intentional than random arcade cabinet number 7 would suggest. The company name Sinneslotion, sense deletion, is almost too perfect, too on the nose for a supposed psychological experiment. Real covert programs use innocuous cover names, generic corporate titles that don't advertise their actual purposes. A company literally named Sense Deletion, creating a mind-altering arcade game, is either remarkably blatant or is someone crafting a legend and choosing a dramatically appropriate but implausibly obvious name, favoring narrative coherence over plausible operational security. The Men in Black collecting data is a borrowed trope from UFO lore and conspiracy culture, generally. Mysterious government agents who appear to suppress information and monitor civilian encounters with classified projects. Their appearance in the Polybius legend connects the game to broader conspiracy narratives, suggests government involvement without requiring specification of which agency or what program, creates atmosphere of surveillance and control that's thematically appropriate, but that's also a recycled element from other legends, rather than a detail that emerged organically from witness accounts. The symptoms attributed to Polybius, amnesia, night terrors, aversion to gaming, are consistent with severe psychological trauma or with certain neurological conditions. But they're also symptoms that would make victims unreliable witnesses. If you develop amnesia and aversion to the thing that caused your symptoms, you can't provide clear testimony about what the game was like, what happened during play, What specific elements triggered your reaction? This creates a built-in explanation for why detailed descriptions of gameplay don't exist from alleged victims. They can't remember or can't bring themselves to engage with gaming topics, conveniently making the central evidence inaccessible. The actual arcade gaming landscape of 1981 does include some relevant context. This was the peak of arcade gaming's golden age, with new games appearing constantly, with intense competition for player attention and quarters. Experimental games with unusual mechanics or presentation did exist, and some games did produce seizures in photosensitive individuals, leading to warnings and modifications. The possibility that an experimental game with particularly intense visuals or novel gameplay mechanics could have caused adverse reactions in a subset of players isn't implausible. What's implausible is that such a game would then be completely memory holed, with no remaining physical evidence, no contemporary documentation, no circuit boards or ROM chips surviving in the hands of collectors or in storage facilities. The Portland location is significant because Portland has reputation for oddness, for being a place where strange things happen or are more readily accepted. Setting the legend in Portland, rather than more conventional locations, adds plausibility through association with a city known for its counterculture and unusual characteristics. But Portland's arcade scene in the 80s had active participants who are still alive and accessible. And when investigators have attempted to find anyone who actually remembers Polybius appearing in Portland arcades in 1981, they've come up empty. Arcade operators, collectors, enthusiasts who were active in that scene at that time don't remember the game, don't remember hearing about mysterious health effects, don't have the collective memory that would exist if something as dramatic as Polybius actually occurred. The psychological experiment theory proposes that Polybius was a military or intelligence project, testing whether interactive entertainment could be used for behavior modification, consciousness alteration, or information gathering. The game would be a disguised testing apparatus placed in public locations where targets would voluntarily engage with it, providing data about how humans respond to specific visual patterns, gameplay mechanics, or subliminal messaging embedded in the game code. This makes Polybius part of the MK Ultra lineage, similar to documented programs where drugs and psychological techniques were tested on unwitting subjects, just using arcade gaming as the delivery mechanism. The technology to create such effects would depend on what specific outcomes were intended. If the goal was inducing seizures or disorientation, rapid flashing patterns and specific color combinations can affect neurological function, particularly in photosensitive individuals. If the goal was subliminal messaging, frames could be inserted below conscious perception threshold, containing images or text that might influence behavior or belief. If the goal was addiction or compulsion, gameplay mechanics could be designed using operant conditioning principles, variable reward schedules, and difficulty curves that create obsessive play patterns. All of this is theoretically possible with 1981 technology, though whether it could be done effectively and covertly remains questionable. The complete absence of physical evidence is what ultimately makes Polybius most likely fictional. Arcade cabinets are large, durable objects. Circuit boards and ROM chips are physical components that don't simply vanish. Even if machines were recalled and destroyed, components circulate through secondary markets, sit in storage, end up in private collections. The arcade collecting community is extensive and dedicated, with people who specialize in tracking down and preserving rare and obscure games. If Polybius machines existed in commercial deployment, even briefly, physical components should exist somewhere in collections, in storage facilities, in landfills, discoverable through forensic investigation, if not through active collecting. The ROM code particularly should exist. Video game code is copied, archived, shared through enthusiast networks, Even extremely rare and obscure arcade games from the 80s have had their ROMs dumped and preserved. The absence of Polybius ROM, despite intensive searching by emulation and preservation communities, strongly suggests there was never ROM to find, never game code that existed, because the game itself never existed except as story. But the legend serves psychological and cultural functions regardless of whether the game was real. It expresses anxieties about technology's effects on consciousness, about corporations or governments using entertainment as tool for manipulation or control, about the addictive properties of gaming and whether they're natural byproducts of engaging design or deliberate exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. Polybius as legend allows discussion of these concerns through the narrative of a game that took these possibilities to extreme, that was purely exploitative, that damaged players deliberately for experimental purposes, making explicit the implicit fears about what entertainment technology might be doing to users. The internet age has transformed how legends like Polybius spread and persist. Pre-internet, urban legends were limited by geographical transmission, by the telephone game distortion that occurs through oral retelling. Internet allows legends to be documented in text, to spread globally instantly, to accumulate elaborations that get added to the canonical version, to be researched and debunked, and yet continue circulating because debunking reaches different audiences than the original legend. Polybius exemplifies this dynamic. It's been thoroughly debunked, with researchers demonstrating the absence of contemporary evidence. Yet it persists in gaming culture, gets referenced in TV shows and video games, maintains presence as the game that drove players crazy, despite the overwhelming likelihood that it never existed. Some researchers have proposed that Polybius might be based on confused memories of real games. Tempest, released in 1981, had vector graphics and intense visual effects that could induce discomfort. Various arcade games from that era did cause seizures in photosensitive players before warnings became standard. Perhaps memories of these real incidents became conflated and elaborated into the Polybius legend, creating a fictional game from fragmentary real experiences with multiple different games and incidents. The false memory angle is particularly interesting. If enough people hear detailed descriptions of Polybius, some percentage may develop false memories of having encountered or played it, their brains constructing memory-like experiences from the legend rather than from actual events. Studies of false memory demonstrate that people can be induced to remember events that didn't happen if they're given enough detail and social confirmation, if the suggested event is plausible within their life context, if they're repeatedly exposed to the narrative. Polybius provides all these elements for people who were arcade gamers in the early 80s, potentially creating a population of people who genuinely believe they remember a game that never existed. Whether Polybius was real psychological experiment, real game with effects that were exaggerated into legend, or pure fiction that has achieved legendary status through internet propagation, the game, or its legend, has become part of gaming culture, a story that gamers know and reference, that represents anxieties about technology and consciousness, that serves as cautionary tale about entertainment that's too engaging or too manipulative, that warns about hidden agendas in commercial products, that suggests reality might contain suppressed histories and removed artifacts that left no trace except stories that persist despite lack of evidence. The search for Polybius continues among some enthusiasts, convinced that somewhere physical evidence exists, that ROM dumps or circuit boards or cabinet components sit in storage waiting to be discovered and prove the legend true. Others have created modern versions, hoax Polybius cabinets, or ROM hacks that attempt to recreate what the legendary game might have been like, blurring the line further between historical artifact and contemporary fiction, making Polybius real in the present even if it was never real in the past. And perhaps that's the ultimate truth of Polybius, that it's more powerful as legend than it could have been as actual game. That the story of a mind-altering arcade cabinet serves cultural and psychological purposes that don't require the game to have been real. That Polybius exists perfectly in the space of maybe happened and probably didn't, of suppressed truth and creative fiction, of conspiracy theory and urban legend, occupying the same uncertain territory as so many other stories that can't be proven, but can't be entirely dismissed, that persist because they express something true about fears and possibilities, even if the specific events described never occurred, leaving Polybius as the game that drove players insane, or the legend that drives researchers insane trying to verify it. The arcade cabinet that appeared and disappeared in 1981, taking players' sanity with it, or the story that appeared in 1998 and has been taking researchers' time and credibility ever since, as they search for evidence of something that all available data suggests never existed outside imagination and internet. A game that was never programmed and never installed and never played, except in the collective consciousness where legends live, where Polybius will remain. As long as people wonder whether somewhere, somehow, maybe it actually was real. Maybe the men in black did collect the machines. Maybe the evidence was successfully suppressed. Maybe Sinneslöschen was real, and the sense deletion they accomplished included deleting all trace of their own existence and their experimental game, leaving only the legend, only the story, only the persistent urban myth of Polybius, the arcade game that drove players insane, the game that might never have existed, but that exists now as legend, as cautionary tale, as mystery that may never be solved because there's nothing to solve, no truth to uncover. Except that humans create powerful stories about things that frighten or fascinate us, and Polybius, real or fictional, has become one of those stories. Permanent fixture in gaming folklore, permanent mystery in conspiracy theory catalogs, permanent question that will likely never receive definitive answer, because the evidence we'd need to prove or disprove it vanished in 1981, or never existed at all, leaving us only with the legend of the game that was too effective, that worked too well, that accessed consciousness in ways that entertainment shouldn't, that drove players insane and then disappeared as completely as if it had never existed, taking with it any certainty about whether any of this actually happened, or whether Polybius is entirely fiction that has successfully masqueraded, though, as suppressed history, leaving us to wonder forever about the arcade cabinet that might have stood in Portland suburbs for 1 month in 1981, might have damaged players' minds, might have been government experiment or corporate accident, or might simply be the most successful gaming urban legend ever created, a story so compelling and so detailed that decades later, people still search for evidence, still believe it might be real, still feel the pull of a mystery that cannot be solved because there's nothing to find, no game to discover, no truth to reveal, except that sometimes the most powerful games are the ones that exist only in imagination, only in legend, only in the persistent story of Polybius, the game that drove players insane, or the game that never existed at all. Number stations, mysterious radio, broadcasts that never stop. Imagine sitting alone in a dark room at 3 a.m, slowly turning the dial on a shortwave radio. Through the static and interference between the fading signals of distant music stations and the crackle of atmospheric noise, you suddenly hear a voice. It's a woman speaking Spanish, but something about her tone isn't quite right. She's not conversing, not announcing, not communicating in any normal sense. She's simply reading numbers. Atención, atención. 3, 7, 2, 9, 4, 8. The voice continues, emotionless and precise, reading 5-digit groups with mechanical rhythm. You listen for a minute. 5 minutes, 10, and the numbers never stop, never explain themselves, never acknowledge that anyone is listening. Then, as abruptly as it began, the transmission ends. Silence. You're left in the darkness, wondering what you just heard, who was meant to hear it, and what those numbers might have instructed someone, somewhere, to do. This isn't fiction. This is happening right now, on frequencies you can access, with equipment you can buy online. Across the shortwave radio spectrum, voices speak into the void continuously, reading numbers that sound random, but carry meaning someone desperately needs to know. They've been doing this for decades, probably longer than anyone publicly admits. No government claims them. No official source acknowledges their purpose. Yet they persist, night after night, broadcasting instructions we can hear, but never understand. Coordinating operations we'll never know about. Moving pieces on a chessboard we can't see. The Cold War made these stations infamous, though they existed before and continue long after. Intelligence agencies needed a way to communicate with agents operating in hostile territory, people who couldn't risk meeting handlers, couldn't use telephones or telegrams that could be monitored, couldn't do anything that would reveal they were receiving instructions from a foreign power. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity and absolutely unbreakable in its security. Broadcast encrypted messages using one-time pad encryption over shortwave radio. The agent needs only a radio and a pad of random numbers. When the transmission comes, they write down the broadcast numbers, apply the corresponding section of their pad, and the message reveals itself. Then they burn that page of the pad. Without that specific pad, the message is mathematically impossible to decrypt. Even with unlimited computing power and infinite time, the enemy can record every transmission, can listen to every broadcast, can capture every signal, and still learn nothing. What makes this system so unsettling is its openness. These aren't hidden communications on classified frequencies. Anyone can listen. Shortwave enthusiasts stumbled onto number stations decades ago and have been documenting them ever since, creating catalogs of stations identified by their characteristics because no one officially names them. The Lincolnshire Poacher began each transmission with bars from an English folk song before a woman's voice read number groups. The station broadcast for over 30 years, believed to be operated by British intelligence from Cyprus, aimed at agents in the Middle East and beyond. Then, in 2008, it simply stopped. No announcement, no explanation. The agents who had spent years listening for that specific musical phrase at specific times would have tuned in one day to find only silence. What does that silence mean? Were the operations complete? Were the agents extracted? Or was something darker implied by that sudden termination? The buzzer is still active, broadcasting from Russia on the same frequency it's occupied for decades. Most of the time, it produces exactly what its name suggests: a harsh, monotonous buzzing tone that repeats approximately 25 times per minute, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Occasionally, the buzzing stops, and a Russian voice reads call signs, numbers, or brief phrases before the buzzing resumes. Sometimes months pass between voice transmissions. What purpose does that constant buzzing serve? Is it claiming the frequency, ensuring no one else uses it? Is it a heartbeat signal, proof the system is operational and monitoring? Or is the buzzing itself encoded information, variations in tone or timing, carrying messages that sophisticated receivers can extract, while casual listeners hear only monotonous repetition? Then there are the children. Some stations use voices that sound impossibly young, speaking with the clarity and innocence of childhood, while reading number sequences that might be ordering surveillance, dead drops, or worse. The Swedish Rhapsody opened with an eerie music box melody. Then a young girl's voice counted in German. 1, 2, 3, 4. The juxtaposition of childlike voice with the cold reality of espionage creates profound unease. Why children's voices? Perhaps they're distinctive, impossible to confuse with normal radio traffic. Perhaps early speech synthesis systems produced these tones more easily. Or perhaps there's something deliberately disturbing about it, something designed to ensure the recipient pays attention, recognizes their specific station among the dozens of broadcasts crossing the shortwave bands on any given night. In 1998, the veil lifted briefly during a U.S. federal prosecution of Cuban intelligence officers operating in Florida. Among the evidence presented in court were recordings of number stations, one-time pads found in the defendant's possession, and decrypted messages proving that broadcast numbers, when processed with the correct pad, yielded intelligence instructions. The Cuban agents had been listening to stations broadcasting from their homeland, receiving orders about what to observe, what to report, who to monitor. The trial provided rare official confirmation of what everyone already knew, but rarely acknowledged. These broadcasts aren't mysteries or anomalies. They're active intelligence operations, communications between handlers and assets, ongoing coordination of espionage, conducted completely in the open, yet absolutely secure. But that case revealed only what one cell was doing, one network's operations. How many other agents listen to how many other stations? How many broadcasts per night carry instructions we'll never know about? The shortwave spectrum is vast, and number stations occupy only tiny slivers of it. Yet enthusiasts have documented hundreds of distinct stations over the decades, broadcasting in Russian, Spanish, English, German, Czech, Korean, Mandarin. Every major intelligence service and many minor ones apparently use this method. Right now, as you read this, someone somewhere is tuning their radio to a predetermined frequency, waiting for the signal that tells them their message is coming, preparing to write down numbers that will tell them what to do next. The broadcasts follow patterns that speak to careful planning and operational security. Many maintain rigid schedules. Same frequency, same time, same day of the week. Others appear to be event-driven, activating only when there's a message to transmit. Some broadcast brief transmissions lasting minutes. Others run for hours, reading thousands of number groups, as if the message is enormous, or as if multiple recipients are pulling different sections from the same broadcast. The formats vary in ways that probably mean something to insiders. 4-figure groups versus 5-figure groups. Letters instead of numbers. Phonetic alphabets. Binary tones that might be automated encryption rather than human-readable content. Each variation suggests different purposes, different operational requirements, different levels in whatever hierarchy coordinates these shadow communications. What haunts the listener is the certainty that these numbers mean something, combined with the impossibility of ever knowing what. You can record them, analyze them, track them, correlate them with world events, and still you're on the outside. The information is right there, transmitted clearly enough that even a cheap radio picks it up. Yet it's as inaccessible as if locked in the deepest vault. Somewhere, someone applied their one-time pad to that transmission and now knows something you never will. Maybe they know where to go for a meeting. Maybe they know what documents to photograph. Maybe they know it's time to disappear, that their cover is blown, that they need to reach an extraction point before counterintelligence finds them. The numbers told them something urgent enough to justify maintaining this entire broadcasting infrastructure, this network of transmitters and scheduled transmissions and agents listening in lonely rooms with radios and pads they'll destroy after reading. Some stations have broadcast for so long they've become fixtures of the shortwave landscape, expected and monitored by enthusiasts who note every variation. When the Lincolnshire poacher fell silent, the community that had tracked it for years felt the absence like a missing tooth, a gap where something significant had been. When new stations appear, using identifiers no one's heard before, speculation runs wild about what nation launched them, what operations they're coordinating, whether their appearance correlates with geopolitical tensions or newly activated intelligence priorities. The community creates databases, archives recordings, maintains schedules of active stations. This crowdsourced surveillance of intelligence communications maps the shadow world more thoroughly than any official oversight could. Yet it reveals nothing about content, nothing about purpose beyond the obvious fact that secrets are being transmitted. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing you're listening to active espionage, that the transmission you're hearing might be instructing an agent to take actions that will affect world events, that someone's life or operation depends on receiving these numbers correctly. The stakes are invisible, but real. If an agent misses their scheduled broadcast, do they have backup protocols? If they copy the numbers wrong, does the decrypted message become gibberish, leaving them uncertain whether to act or wait for confirmation? If counterintelligence is listening, do they try to jam the signal? Or do they let it broadcast because locating the transmitter tells them less than identifying who's listening would? The technology seems almost quaint now, a relic of an era before encrypted smartphones and secure satellite links. Yet number stations haven't disappeared. They've adapted, incorporating digital modes and new transmission techniques. But the fundamental concept persists because it works. The agent transmits nothing, accesses nothing, does nothing that surveillance can detect except owning a radio, which is perfectly legal and completely common. The broadcast itself is public, deniable, and unbreakable without the pad. Modern encryption can be attacked through mathematical breakthroughs, implementation flaws, or computing advances. One-time pad encryption, properly implemented, is the only provably unbreakable cipher. As long as the pad is truly random, used only once, and kept secret, the message is absolutely secure, regardless of who intercepts it or what resources they apply to cracking it. Some broadcasts seem designed to confuse or overwhelm. Stations that transmit constantly, filling the spectrum with noise and numbers, making it harder to distinguish which transmissions are real and which might be deception. Broadcasts that follow patterns for years, then suddenly change format, identifier, or schedule. Stations that appear briefly, then disappear, leaving listeners uncertain whether they heard an actual intelligence transmission or something else entirely. The fog of uncertainty serves operational security. If counterintelligence can't reliably distinguish real agent communications from noise and deception, they can't efficiently focus resources on tracking the meaningful traffic. There are also anomalies that defy easy explanation, even from people who've studied number stations for decades. Broadcasts that don't fit typical patterns, transmissions using modulation or encoding that doesn't match known intelligence communication profiles, stations that appear in frequency ranges or formats that seem impractical for the supposed purpose. Are these experiments with new techniques? Cover for something else? Communications for purposes we haven't considered? The shortwave spectrum contains mysteries beyond even the acknowledged mystery of number stations themselves. Late at night, when atmospheric conditions allow shortwave signals to travel thousands of miles, when the spectrum fills with distant broadcasts from around the world, you can scan through and find them. The voices reading numbers in languages you don't speak. The tones pulsing in patterns that might encode information beyond the obvious audio. The stations that identify themselves with musical phrases or call signs that mean nothing to you, but everything to someone listening with a pad and pencil, ready to decode instructions that might send them into danger, that might save their life, that might be the last message they receive before something goes wrong and they're never heard from again. This is happening now. Not in the past, not in spy novels, but right now on frequencies you can access. Someone is broadcasting. Someone is listening. Someone is decoding messages that you and I will never read, taking actions we'll never know about, playing roles in operations that remain secret, perhaps, forever. The numbers continue, mechanical and relentless, carrying meaning through the noise, connecting handlers to assets across hostile borders, and through surveillance that can intercept anything except information secured by mathematics and randomness. The voices read on into the darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, someone is writing down every number, knowing their life might depend on getting it exactly right.